Hello and welcome to the Happiness Festival, hosted by the Happiness Institute in association with Gowing Life. We are honoured to be joined today by Professor Richard Barker, OBE. Richard is a British life science and healthcare leader, board member, advisor and speaker. He has also authored two books, 2030, The Future of Medicine, and Biosciences Lost in Translation, where he talks about the increasing failure to translate biomedical research from the laboratories into healthcare systems improvements, and what can be done to tackle this problem. Richard is also the founding director of the Centre Advancement of Sustainable Medical Innovation, or CASMI, a collaboration between the University of Oxford and University College London. Thank you so much for joining me today, Richard.
Pleased to be with you.
And today, Richard will be talking about the future of medicine. So whenever you're ready, Richard, take it away.
Chris, thanks very much. So I'm going to be talking about the connection between medicine and health and happiness. I think they belong together, not just on birthday cards. It doesn't mean to say that you have to be healthy to be happy or happy to be healthy. But I think I'd like to remind you of a number of different connections between the two. But I'd like to start maybe first with my definition of the two. So health is not just the absence of disease, but more broadly wellness, or what I'm calling personal health resilience, which is robustness in the face of challenges like the virus that's been facing us. This virus, I think, will have changed a lot of people's minds about the need to maintain their personal health resilience. And it requires more and more effort the older you can get. I can attest to that. But it's never too early to start working on your health resilience. The state of health resilience is a function of the organs in your body, whether you're talking about the brain, the heart, the liver, and so on, and some systemic parts of the body to your cardiovascular system, your immune system, your microbiome. All of these things are part of your personal health resilience. We know when we have disease, of course, usually, but we are beginning to learn the biomarkers of wellness. And so we need to be able to focus on those aspects of resilience that we can measure and improve over time. Happiness, how do I think about happiness? My guess is that almost everybody involved in the Happiness Institute and Festival will probably have a slightly different definition of happiness because it's a subjective state, right? To me, it includes moments of pure joy, but also quiet contentment. It's certainly more than the absence of unhappiness. Interestingly, again, over the years, happiness tends to increase. But that sense of contentment tends to increase. Obviously, it goes up and down with life course and life changes. We don't have very many markers, so to speak, of happiness. Although gamma activity in the left prefrontal cortex of the brain does seem to correlate with how happy people report. But fundamentally, of course, happiness is a state you sense rather than something outside that someone can measure. So what are some of the links between health and happiness that I see, and what factors could lead to both? First of all, our state of mind, our mindset, if you like, or our mindfulness. More and more talk about mindfulness. A peaceful mind, which tends to go with happiness, but it has real health benefits. Whether you meditate or not, the ability to rest the mind induces a state reduces your stress hormones, reduces your heart rate, and it even, over time, reduces the telomeres, the lengths of genome at the end of your genetics. But actually, meditation reduces that. It's a sign of, if you like, getting younger. I've been reading a book which I would recommend to anybody called The Restful Mind by Doc Hamper. And he comes from Bhutan, which I was lucky enough to visit last year. Some of you probably know that Bhutan is a very Buddhist country, but it's also a country that measures its progress as gross national happiness index, not gross domestic product. So they evaluate projects and ideas in the country on whether they're likely to lead to greater happiness or not. So imagine if the rest of us measured everything that we do, or all of those things nationally that we do, on gross national happiness rather than gross domestic product. And I suspect we would do a lot of very different things if we did that. For many people, mindfulness is linked to spirituality or faith, and scientists can measure the link between spiritual practice or faith and our state of mental health, if you like. Prayer, meditation, mindfulness can be measured in terms of improved life expectancy, lower blood pressure, reduced cholesterol, and reduced levels of pain. So another person I would recommend you seek out is Mathieu Ricard, who's made a very interesting journey from being a molecular biologist in the Institut Pasteur in Paris to being a Tibetan monk. He's called by one journalist the world's happiest man, and he talks about being familiar with your mind, making friends with your mind. And he defines happiness as a deep sense of serenity and fulfillment, the ability of the mind to override external conditions, if you will. For many, mindfulness is actually living in the present. I've had an interesting experience during this lockdown that we've all been suffering through. I found that my relationship with time has changed quite dramatically, actually. I realized that through most of my life, I regarded time as a challenge. How much can I get done in the time that I have? I sort of gulped time down like a cold drink on a hot day. And I've learned actually to sip time as it goes past. I don't think that means I'm less productive, but it does mean that I'm more thoughtful about every moment of time. And actually, my blood pressure has reduced, hopefully reducing the risk of future disease for me. Related to this sort of mindset and mindfulness is our sense of personal positivity. Life throws us many challenges. Ideally, we remain captain of our soul, as the poet William Ernest Henley puts it. Things may happen to our health, but this ability to remain positive is something I think that connects health and happiness in a fairly fundamental way. So coming back briefly to this idea of personal health resilience, our body systems are very complex and they interconnect. And the way in which they respond to challenges like this nasty virus varies from one person to another, but it typically involves the mind-body connection. Not many people know this, but we've learned in recent years about the vagus nerve, which goes from the brain to many parts of our bodies. It's a key connection between our mental state and our physical responses. For example, how we feel about ourselves, but more broadly, whether we're developing diabetes or whatever. And we seem to be able to improve the tone of our vagus nerve by mindfulness, by meditation, by what the author and speaker Barbara Fredrickson calls micro moments of positive connections with others. What I like about her YouTube video is that she says what happens in Vegas doesn't necessarily stay in Vegas, talking about the vagus nerve. But she says that fleeting moments of positivity between people can increase our awareness and our emotional resources, our emotional resilience, becoming better versions of ourselves, if you like. So what I'm trying to do is paint here a picture of a two-way street between our happiness and our personal health resilience, each supporting the other. There are, of course, other connections. Take music. You may have had a lot of recourse to music over the lockdown period. Music hath charms to soothe the savage breast. Happy music, which is usually in a fast tempo, in a major key, can cause our breath to be faster and our happiness to increase. What we might perceive as sad music, which tends to be in a minor key and tends to be slower, causes a slowing of the pulse and a rise in blood pressure. So music is something that can connect health and happiness. So can exercise, as it turns out. I've been reliant on yoga and a rowing machine for most of the last few months, more so than I felt for a long time. My normal working life is 10,000 steps per day in the polluted air of central London, rushing from one appointment to another. But now I can have appointments. On one day, I think I was talking to people in Moscow, Seattle, Scottsdale, Oxford, London, without moving from this chair. But therefore, it's more and more important to take healthier exercise. And health and as a happiness and exercise are connected in two particular ways. Exercise improves your immune system, and it also releases endorphins. My favorite exercise is walking in mountains, which I think of as a kind of triple whammy. You get the wonderful views, you get the fresh air, and you get the build-up of stamina and fitness. So it improves your overall state of mind. Finally, our relationships are very important. You may know of a Harvard study that tracked both Harvard students and a similar sized group of ordinary blokes from the Boston suburbs over more than 70 years, calling them up every year and asking them various questions about their health and happiness. There were two rather interesting findings. The South Boston regular people would often say, "Why are you so interested in me?" The Harvard graduates never asked that question. But more importantly, over long periods of time, the most important factor in keeping people healthy in that study was the quality of their close relationships, not the quantity, but the quality of their close relationships. The study says close relationships more than money and fame are what keep people happy throughout their lives. Those ties protect people from life's discontents, help to delay mental and physical decline, and so on. And so that finding was true both of the Harvard men, and they were all men, and the people from elsewhere in Boston. I mentioned, or I would mention that I'm a scientist. I told a friend I was preparing a talk on this subject, and so he sent me this equation. I don't know whether you can read it all. The equation links brain responses in the pleasure centers of the brain to rewards and the expectation of rewards. They found that rewards themselves are not the best predictor of happiness. The most powerful predictor of happiness was whether or not they exceeded people's expectations. That's rather a more mathematical version of Mo Gawdat of Google's theory that happiness is the difference between the events of life and the expectations of how we think life should be. He also believes that happiness is a default setting and that unhappiness results from other apps we install in our lives, apps that focus on things that drive a negative difference between the reality of our lives and our expectations of it. So therefore, I would offer the following equations, so to speak, for happiness. Happiness is mindfulness plus positivity plus enjoyment of things like music and exercise, plus perhaps relationships squared. And I think health equals happiness, or health and happiness connect very strongly to each other. So to finish, I was asked to speak on happiness and the future of medicine, the future of healthcare, perhaps because of a book that Chris mentioned that I wrote about 10 years ago, 2030, The Future of Medicine. Looking back at that book, I did in fact highlight the likelihood of pandemics as one of the factors that would stress the health systems of the future. And I also highlighted the importance of all of us being engaged in our own health, in our own self-care. This is one of the most important factors, not just in personal health, but also in the sustainability of our health systems. But it was actually only when preparing this talk that I realized the depth of the connections between wellness and happiness. So I'm very grateful that Kian asked me to do this. And so let me close by hoping that all of those listening to this will be able to work on their happiness health connections for a happy and healthy future. Thanks.
Richard, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely brilliant. I absolutely loved the equation of happiness formula that you gave. I think that's it. I think we've solved it. I think you've solved happiness. But yeah, no, thank you very much. A really, really, really interesting talk. So obviously you mentioned it's actually interesting. You mentioned a Harvard study. We've got the director of that, Robert Waldinger, speaking with Google soon as part of our lineup, which will be really interesting. So you should definitely check that out. But yeah, obviously health is a fundamental part of happiness. Obviously, you can have happiness without health, but it is intrinsic to the majority of people's happiness. And your day to day is more in medical innovation, so that's where I want to start off. You mentioned we did a previous interview around about 6 months ago, where you mentioned that innovation in the life sciences and in digital health is the only hope for the future of the NHS or other healthcare systems around the world. Now, since we last spoke, obviously, as you mentioned, we are very deep into a pandemic which has reshaped our lives globally, and tested all healthcare systems around the world. So my question is, sort of during this crisis, what are the innovations in both life sciences and the digital health systems that fill you with optimism for the future? And what shortcomings to innovations have you noticed?
Excellent question, and I think very, very timely. So what we've seen on the success side is the very rapid replacement of about half in the UK, but I think it's true elsewhere, of consultations between patients and doctors have gone digital. Now, the vast majority of them have gone to the telephone rather than, as we are, speaking to each other over a video link. But doctors and patients both discover they quite like that, actually, rather than queuing up for, or rather ringing up for an appointment. It's much easier, actually, to have access to your doctor in that kind of way. And so millions and millions of consultations just in Britain alone have taken place that way. But we've also seen much more rapid innovation in the areas of testing, although, of course, we've all had some controversies about the volume of tests, but bringing new tests to market. Vaccines, obviously, we've seen very rapid progress on vaccines. And there are hundreds of trials of things that might improve health. And so that process, you mentioned my second book about Lost in Translation, the translation of things have happened much more rapidly under the urgency of the pandemic. So the key challenge for us all is how can we sustain some of those changes?
Exactly as you mentioned, I think the Milken Institute at the moment is tracking, I think it's roughly 179 vaccines. Out of these, only two are actually currently in phase 2 trials. Most of the rest are in preclinical trials. How can these companies use some of the techniques described, as you said in your latest book, Biosciences Lost in Translation, and how precision medicine closes the innovation gap to ensure that we have a vaccine as soon as possible? And how do we ensure that we have enough for everyone?
Well, you've asked three very important questions, right? So firstly, vaccine obviously works for everyone, so it isn't actually an example of precision medicine. But the most interesting examples of precision medicine is how everybody that has this virus and is severely affected appears to get a different set of symptoms. And so the best way of treating people, there isn't really a standard formula. And so we will have learned a lot. Sadly, in many cases, failed to save people. We would have learned a lot about the need to personalize treatment once somebody catches it. But I think our hope of everybody around the world is that we have not just one, but a number of vaccines available within the next few months. So that, in fact, we don't have hospitals full of ICU patients that are struggling with the virus.
In the same book, you talk about the increasing failure of university-based research to translate to where you can effectively use the research to help better the everyday lives of the general public. The most well-known opposite to this will probably be MIT in the US, who are well known for their proficiency of, producing startups and such. Is it the university's responsibility to try and change this to become maybe more like somewhere like MIT? And how do you instill this and go about incentivizing this change?
Which sort of goes back to what makes people happy again, right? We shouldn't get too far off that topic. What makes researchers happy? Well, usually what makes them happy is grant money and publications in peer-reviewed journals. We need to be able to communicate with researchers that they can and should also be pretty happy by seeing their discoveries turn into practical innovations that help people. Of course, many are like that, not just people in MIT, but around the world. But interestingly enough, in the UK, which has not always covered itself in glory with regard to translation of innovation, many universities, particularly my kind of alma mater, which is Oxford, the number of times I've heard this Don or this professor from Oxford, well, of course, one of the leading vaccines is Sarah Gilbert's vaccine from Oxford, but also work on epidemiology, work on testing and so on, have come out of these institutions. So I hope that actually one of the beneficial side effects of this dreadful virus is that it'll wake up to many of the people who do basic research. Wouldn't it be wonderful if it make a big difference to people's lives? And I think it's the only way we'll get out of this mess.
Professor David Sinclair, who is, sort of a big figure in the aging game, really, recently published a paper in which he highlighted that COVID-19 disproportionately affects older people, and that biological age is the highest mortality risk factor for COVID-19. Now, Professor Sinclair thinks that, therefore, elderly coronavirus patients should be given anti-aging drugs to make their immune systems younger, in effect, so that they can fight the virus faster. Now, you are also a great advocate for treating biological age, the underlying root cause for non-communicable chronic diseases. What do you think about Professor Sinclair's approach to treating COVID-19?
We'll start with the facts. He's dead right. So sorry to put it that way, he's dead right that age is the biggest risk factor. There are other risk factors, particularly things like diabetes or anything that impairs your immune function. For example, if you're a post-transplant patient taking things, immunosuppressants. But age is by far and away the largest factor. And so the more we can work on age, the better. I think that David's proposal is a long-term proposal, not a short-term proposal. There's nothing I can quickly take 10 years off my biological life, or whatever exercise I take, 10 years off my biological life. It's in all of our interests to investigate those things that we can responsibly do and responsibly take, that will make our biological age lower, even if we can't do anything about our chronological. So he's right, but I think it's a long-term thing rather than something that can help us in the next few months.
And a broader question, do you think we are better off trying to find treatments that reduce the rate of biological aging rather than treating one chronic disease at a time?
Chronic disease, obviously, age is the biggest risk factor. For many, many people, they get type 2 diabetes and then from there to cardiovascular problems, kidney problems, etc., etc. And so the best thing is to not start that process, not start the process of multimorbidity. But there, I think you have to start your actions back in your 30s and 40s rather than in your 50s and 60s when these diseases normally strike. Now, we don't know yet if there's something you can take that will do that. I mean, there's this Metformin trial that's been going on. Near us in Israel has been running this trial now for the last couple of years, Neil Barzilai. But we don't know yet how effective that will be. Some excellent work in Oxford by Lynn Cox is looking at the impact of certain agents on the senescence of cells, the fact that cells shut down but don't go away. Wouldn't it be great if they went away, because they often are the basis for some of the symptoms of chronic disease. This is a long game, as I said about David's proposals. So I think we're going to have to see in the next 10 or 20 years how this unfolds. I was part of something called the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Healthy Longevity in the UK recently, which produced a big report called Health of the Nation. Interestingly enough, we worried a lot when we produced this report about whether government would be interested in some of the recommendations which intervene in the lives of people. Now, it was well known that our current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was an anti-nanny state person, did not like the idea of the state intervening. Surprise, surprise, he caught coronavirus, and he knew that obesity was a big factor. So we're all expecting some announcements soon from Number 10 Downing Street of an anti-obesity thing, which might include things like further sugar taxes and might include other ways of encouraging people to exercise and so on. So that one experience might well have accelerated the UK's move towards a healthier environment, including the ability to control obesity, which is the biggest risk factor for diabetes and all of the things that might follow.
So Boris Johnson's predecessor, ex-Prime Minister Theresa May, I think, stated that it was her goal to increase health span of UK citizens by, I think, 5 years within her time in office, but obviously which ended up being much shorter than she, I think, envisioned, but that's beside the point. The health span is obviously the age at which the average person has lived to without a chronic disease or chronic condition, which is currently 68 in the UK. I'm sure this goal is shared by many sort of leaders from around the world to increase health span. How likely do you think this is within sort of the time frame of 5 years? So an increase in health span plus 1 year every year, and what can be done by at the state level to accelerate this?
So just a couple of points of context. What Theresa May actually said was 5 years more healthy life by 2035. And that remains part of government policy. So the Health of the Nation report that I mentioned a few minutes ago embodies that, says, let's see if we can make 5 years difference. The sad fact is, however, that the health in terms of healthy lifespan is reducing slightly in the UK. So I don't know how we measure what years that we would save, but it will require a number of different factors. Some of them, yes, they can be legislated for. So we already have a sugar and drinks tax. Governments around the world can put more tax on sugar, which is perhaps one of the biggest risk factors for obesity and so on. A lot of this is down to us as individuals. The happiness health connection that we've been talking about is so important. If one can understand that you don't want to spend the last 10, 20, maybe even 30 years of your life struggling with multiple morbidity, and you therefore need to start taking action a few decades before that, that's something that we have to get into our own heads. And I think the good news, if it's good news, a silver lining, if you like, is I think the COVID crisis will have brought more people to that realization.
So you obviously mentioned that health is so intrinsic in happiness, and vice versa. In the sort of governmental level, and you mentioned the document that stated by 2035 that we wanted to increase the health span. I wonder how much emphasis in that sort of document is there put on happiness as a sort of biomarker, because obviously if you're happy, that tends to make people healthier.
Well, I'll have to look back at the report, but I don't think there was any mention of that, which is why I said at the end of my talk that I'm rather glad to have been asked to prepare something on that connection. I think there needs to be more of that. Can you imagine the revolution of measuring our progress as a nation, if I say the UK, but true of anywhere, on the gross happiness index, the gross national happiness index? Maybe it's rather important at the moment because the GDP will have fallen off the cliff in most countries in the world. So we ought to take a certain amount of, if you like, consolation if we can drive up the happiness index. Of course, I'm being a bit glib, because if you lose your job, or you can't meet your friends, or all of these effects, then your happiness is not necessarily going to have improved. But one of the key things that comes from some of the teaching that I mentioned is we need to get to a mental state so that we're not dependent on what happens to us externally to maintain internal sense of happiness.
And you mentioned you've been to Bhutan to visit. Obviously, they, like you said, they measure their gross national happiness. I wonder, has that had an impact on health in individuals in that country?
That's a piece of research I think it would be great to do. It did occur to me, but it is also a relatively poor country. So they get a lot of exercise, by the way, because they're fairly high up in that elevation. But whether their diet is as good as it might be, because it's a little bit like the Indian diet with lots of oil involved in the food and so on. But the question you asked was a question that occurred to me when I was there. I wonder if we can see that connection over time. But one of the big confounding factors is it's a relatively poor country, and relatively poor countries have lower life expectancy.
Yeah, I agree. I think that would be a very interesting piece of research, definitely. And some of life's most stressful and trying times are when yourself or someone is diagnosed with a life-threatening or life-altering disease or condition. Cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and then the battle trying to fight it. How do we shift from a reactionary healthcare system? I don't know if that is how you would deem it, but which primarily deals with conditions after they become diagnosed and prominent, to a system that relies on preventative medicine initially to stop a disease in its tracks before it even becomes a problem, to avoid all of that sort of stress.
So we have to shift the focus. And one of the papers that I wrote as part of the Health of the Nation report with a colleague, Charles Alessi, is calling for the proportion of expenditure in the NHS on prevention to rise dramatically from it's around 5% at the moment to at least 15%. And I think that there's a great deal the system can do to encourage people and to get a reward, so to speak, the doctors in the system to do the preventative things, the proactive things that you're mentioning. Of course, cancer, the majority of cancers come out of the blue, so to speak, but your probability reduces, probability of Alzheimer's disease, and as I've already said, probability of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and so on. They can all be reduced by having a general sense of personal wellness driven by diet, exercise, and, if you like, a positive state of mind. So I think that were we to be successful in encouraging the NHS, like all health systems around the world, to both measure and reward the preventative activity, that will lead both to better long-term outcomes, but also, as you say, to greater personal happiness for the citizens.
Amazing. Now we've got a couple of final questions that we ask every speaker. So the first one is, if you had unlimited resources to fund one field of research to make lives happier in the world, what would it be?
Goodness, that is a tough question. I'd love to see what everybody else said. So one form of research to enhance people's happiness. I think it would be important to understand what people believe drives happiness. And so that's social science research, if you like. So which of the following factors here, do you think contribute to happiness? But also, what are the things that could be changed that would assist that process? So that's one form of, if you like, sociological research. I think now that we understand much more about the mind-body connections, I mentioned a little bit about the vagus nerve, well, there are all kinds of science we could do. Right? So we can put electrodes on your brain to measure your brain waves. We can put you in a functional MRI machine to measure which parts of the brain light up when you're thinking about this or doing that. So I think there's a lot of basic science we can do on happiness, although I'm not sure yet we've pinned down the sort of quiet contentment that a Buddhist monk would describe as happiness.
And finally, quite a personal question, but what does happiness mean to you?
So I think, as I probably said at the start of this, I've had a few points in my life where I felt completely happy. And it's usually when there's been no stress, no pressure, no appointments and so on, walking in the Himalayan mountains or wherever. But I think the much more valuable form of happiness is the through time sense of contentment. That you feel, okay, things may happen, things may be happening, but underneath it all, you feel that life has been good to you, which it has been to me. And if you can share a little bit of that in terms of compassion for others, that'll boost your happiness too. So I would say that sort of serenity is a big word, but that sense of quiet contentment, that's what I mean by it.
Amazing. Well, I think that's brilliant, and thank you so much for joining us, Professor Richard Barker. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you again. It's my second time having the privilege to host you, so thank you again for joining us at the Happiness Festival.
Chris, I very much enjoyed it, and I really look forward to watching all the other videos and panels. Thank you very much.
Thank you.